I'm Kurt Kelly. I'm the CEO and president of the Florida Coalition for Children, and I wanted to mention on Senator Lemieux's presentation yesterday, he talked about some of the most exciting things, some of the first and some of the best things we have going on in Florida. But one thing that you probably don't know, and I certainly am aware of this, when it comes to child welfare and providing services for children, you know, and I tell us the legislature, I said, would you believe that we are the best in America? And they go, no. Well, that's because you read all the articles. Dana, you're right. If we don't tell our story, nobody else will tell the right story. But in child welfare, we are actually leading the nation. And it's because of our legislature and the vision for a lot of the work that we're doing. Well, let's get into this time. I will tell you, I'm very excited about this. We're at our 40th anniversary. But I'll start with this. It was 40 years ago this year that I was traveling to Florida State University to start classes there. And I turned that corner when you go around Appalachian, you turn, and right there's a place where you can see the Capitol, the old Capitol, and then the new Capitol behind it. And I got chills. And when I was a member of the legislature, there are times I'd be doing the same thing. I'd get the same thing. I went into a class with a lady that was just known as sort of the dean of deans in political science. Her name was Daisy Flory. And it's an 8 o'clock Monday morning class. In that class, I had Keith Arnold, who's sitting right back there. I think it's your first class at Florida State. Sam Ard, Rick Flagg, who's a reporter, Beth Gosnell, reporter. And Daisy Flory would come in and say, good morning, Mr. Arnold. Good morning, Mr. Ard. Good morning, Mr. Kelly. Please sit up. And we would have this great conversation about the state of Florida. It was a state government class. And she said that her hopes were for us, that we would have a love for our Constitution, a love for our system of government, not a love for government, but our love for system of government, and that we would have a desire to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. I will tell you that today I have the opportunity to introduce a panel of men who I've served with, worked with, spent time with, get to spend time with them now, who have been just that. Great leaders here in Florida, some in Washington. Great leaders that care deeply about their community, and they continue to act and work for the betterment of our state. I'm going to do a little bit different, gentlemen. Instead of reading your bios, by the way, if you need to see the bios and the bona fides of these gentlemen, it's all in the packet there. I won't read that to you. But I will tell you, I will introduce them for you. And I'm going to ask you a question. After I introduce you, I'm going to ask you singularly if you would just tell me, why did you decide to step up and become a public servant? All right? We're going to start with Lieutenant Governor Jeff Kottkamp. Jeff is, if you've known him at any time at all, he is very kind, very thoughtful, extraordinarily level-headed. The first time I met him, I went into a meeting. I'd just gotten elected. I came in, I sat down with him. He said, tell me about your legislation. I was talking about a piece of legislation that I was working on that was challenging, but it was around a tragedy of a young lady that had been murdered at UCF. And I was working on some legislation. And he gave me some very sage and thoughtful advice on the way to deal with that legislation. And we got it passed the House and the Senate unanimously, and it became the governor's #1 piece of legislation. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Kottkamp. Jeff, would you please, you can give him a round of applause. Tell me why you got involved in politics.
I was one of those very unusual kids. I remember one summer, Mom, I was probably 6 or 7 years old, and said, why don't you go outside and play? And I said, okay, Mom, but what are we going to do about Congress? I was always interested reading stories of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. But as I told you yesterday, what really put me over the top was the 1976 campaign of Ronald Reagan. There was something about the way he communicated to people, the way that he spoke about this country being the last best hope of mankind, that shining city of on a hill that really lit a spark in me and made me want to serve.
And thank you so much for your service. We'll get to the questions in just a second. Now let me go to Attorney General Bill McCollum. I first got to meet Bill and his beautiful wife, Ingrid. And I spent a lot of time with him. I was running for Congress. You were running for governor about the same time. I spent more time with your wife in the Orlando area. That was where I was. Just, again, a man that is a respected leader. But if you were to just open him up with open heart surgery, you'd see he has a heart of public service, especially protecting our citizens. That's why he was a great attorney general. General, tell me, what led you into politics?
I grew up in a family interested in government and politics, I think, and I just simply naturally gravitated that way. I was a key clubber. I went to Boys State, participated in that. In college, I was really active at the University of Florida. And when I came out, even though I was practicing law, I couldn't stay away from things like this. So one thing led to another. I was elected to Congress. I was very fortunate to go in with Ronald Reagan in 1980, and I had a wonderful experience, and I tell a lot of young people about that. I never took a political science course. I never took a public speaking course, but I will tell you, serving the people is really what it's all about, and you don't have to have all that background to do it.
Thank you. You can give him. Next, we have a great man that I have known for, 1981 is the first time I met him. He was Senator Scott, became the president of the Senate from this area down here in South Florida, certainly Fort Lauderdale area. And again, if you meet him, you'll see he's a very kind, but he has a great sense of humor. You always see him with a great smile. Well, he needed that. He was in the Senate, so you had to have that to work with senators. Senator Scott, tell us why you decided to get into this arena.
Well, first of all, I learned how to fake that smile when I was campaigning. No, but I really came to Tallahassee as a delegation attorney for the Broward legislators. And I was there a couple years. Back then, you had to have local bills to do anything that would be effective in the cities. And we had 30 cities in Broward. So, and I observed the Senate and met some of the people, knew Senator Ken Plant and Dempsey Barron. And then all of a sudden in 1976, they were retiring some of the local senators, David Lane, and I wasn't happy with who was running, some House members that were running. So I came up to Tallahassee the last week to get Van Poole to run for the Senate. This was on Wednesday, and he didn't want to do it. So Kenny Plant and them started working on me, and on Friday I decided to do it in June the 1st with the September primary. And it was a great decision. My wife was shocked when I came home. I never planned to run for office, but I feel like I did feel the need for the philosophy, for some of the things that I know this organization believes in. So I decided to go try to do something about it instead of just sitting home and reading the Miami Herald and complaining.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Scott. And then finally, and certainly not last, Speaker Tom Feeney. Tom runs a statewide organization, an association. You don't run them, they run you, quite frankly. You're not herding cats, you're herding big tigers. And he does a great job in that. But he also, I guess you got your training as leading the Florida House. So, Tom, thank you for your great service. Anyone that knows him recognizes him to be sort of a very affable, but no nonsense. And so, Tom, tell us why you decided to get into this.
Well, I'm a little bit like Jeff. I started real young. By the time I was 9 or 10, I was devouring William F. Buckley's magazine, National Review. I still read it religiously. I came in off the football fields on Sunday afternoons with my 10-year-old buddies to never missed an episode of Firing Line. By the time I was 13, my Christmas present that year that I liked best was the Political Almanac, which is a digest of every major American political leader. I decided I wanted to be a congressman. I looked through there. Everybody was either a farmer, an agriculture magnate, a rich guy, a Rockefeller or a Kennedy, or they were a lawyer. So I knew I wasn't a farmer, and I knew I wasn't rich. I went to law school.
Makes sense. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Tom Feeney. All right, so here's the ground rules. I'm going to ask a question. You guys, we can go in no particular order. We can go right down the line if you want to do so. And if you happen to have a question out here that you may want to follow up, just raise your hand if we can get to it. We have a few minutes, that we've got about 45 minutes to get through this. So if you have some questions, we want to allow you to have the opportunity as well. So we heard yesterday that there's something called a political campaign coming up next year. It has something to do with a presidential race. Anybody heard about that? Florida is going to be a major player. Now, unfortunately, if you were to take a poll of most of the people here in Florida and around the United States, they'd say what's going on in Washington right now is dysfunctional. Let me ask you this. What do you see is going to happen in Florida, guys? We'll start here with Jeff. What do you think is going to happen here in Florida? And do you see that polarization, that sort of dysfunction affecting the Florida legislature?
The legislature?
Legislature and even the governor's office, any of it?
No. We're insulated for the most part from national politics in Tallahassee. The legislature runs very smoothly. The governor has come out strong, a very strong first session, and I have every anticipation he'll have a strong second session. You're hearing from House leadership in particular telling members this is an election year, stay away from controversial issues if you can, and so I expect that they will. And so as nasty and dysfunctional as D.C. will continue to be, I don't think that's going to impact the ability of the Florida legislature to do its job.
General?
Well, first of all, I chair an organization called the Republican State Leadership Committee. It's a volunteer job on my part. We have a national organization after the two political parties' committees were prohibited by the McCain-Feingold Act from raising corporate money and contributing to state races. And under this organization are the caucuses of the state legislative Republican leaders, as well as the secretaries of state and we used to be the attorneys generals, but lieutenant governors are there with an organization, and now we have the ag commissioners. So I see where it is, not just in Florida, but all over the country. And the basic thrust of that is, despite what's going on in Washington and with Donald Trump and all of the debate over impeachment, the fundamentals are still very much at the state level. And I don't think many of the legislative bodies are going to change. Virginia was an exception because of redistricting. It's a huge battle this time, though, because a lot of money is being put in by both political parties, a lot of effort nationally. Since after this election, the next legislatures of our states, including Florida's, will be involved in redistricting because the census comes along and that's what happens. So there's a huge battleground going on in the country for that control. There's also a big battleground in certain key states with regard to the Supreme Courts of those states. What happened in Virginia recently was largely because the Virginia Supreme Court was controlled by a group that were much more liberal and Democrat-oriented. They'd redrawn the districts recently in the legislative districts in that state, and the losses that were there, and the Republicans lost the legislature, as you probably know, both the Senate and the House. Every one of those seats were competitive. In the end, they were not competitive. They were competitive before that redistricting, and afterwards they were not. But what I see overall in the country, and I see in Florida, is that things are basically good. Our leaders come to these meetings nationally. I get to see them, both from our Senate and our House. Florida's in good shape. We have the most battleground we'll have is in the state Senate, as always. But I believe that that's not in real jeopardy this time, but the Democrats will put a lot of money into it.
Senator, let me just say, while you're answering this, is there any particular issue that you see is coming up in the Senate that may play in with some of this sort of dysfunction that we're seeing come out of Washington?
Well, first of all, I'm not quite as optimistic as my colleagues up here. I'm worried about the state Senate. I've watched this for a long time. When I started, there were 9 Republicans out of 40, and we finally got 21, and then 27, and now we have 23. So this group cannot take that for granted, that we could end up, losing some more Senate seats, or maybe not winning some that we should. And I think that some of the issues, the governor is just, I can't say enough, and I've served with governors back to Reuben Askew, the way he's doing this, the issues, he's raising the school security, the environment, teacher pay, frankly, and I think that those issues, particularly, for example, the school choice issue, is going to play into these state elections and also ultimately into the presidential election. People may not be aware, but we all know that minorities, African Americans, don't necessarily vote Republican, like rarely, but 19% of the women voted for Ron DeSantis, and it's credited one of the main issues, for example, is the education and the betterment of their children so they can be better than they were and their ancestors.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Speaker, I want you to focus on the House side. Do you see anything particularly that they may be addressing that could be playing in sort of the national, some of the national dysfunction?
Yeah, well, in general, legislatures, like particularly the incumbents, who tend to be the majority party and set the agenda, they like to avoid the more controversial issues. If you're going to do big, tough reforms, you try to do it in non-election years. So I suspect that we're going to see, other than the fight over Visit Florida, and Dana Young is doing a great job advocating for protecting it. There is some possibility we'll get some pro-business tort reform. Governor DeSantis made some excellent picks to the Florida Supreme Court. We haven't had pro-business tort reform in a long time. Last year we had a piece on assignment of benefits. There are some other issues that the House leadership is talking about. But there are some very positive things you can do that are sort of bipartisan. They could play well and could isolate elections here in Florida from whatever happens if there's a national tidal wave one way or the other. And Senator Scott's right. There's at least 2 very competitive state Senate seats. They're going to be within a whisker, and they could be impacted by what happens at the presidential level of turnout. But things like workforce development, things like more money for education and teachers is always popular in an election year. There's some work being done on by a cybersecurity task force. So our entire state infrastructure, business, and government is at threat for the first time that we're aware of. We could literally see a collapse of our utilities in a region, banks, transportation, GPS, and anarchy created. So the governor and the legislature have appointed a task force. We do hurricane response well. Resiliency is an important issue, and moving that into cyber is something I think more Americans, as they have their own computers penetrated on a regular basis. And then finally, the opportunities in aerospace are just incredible. Wilbur Ross is someone I've had dinner with several times, the U.S. Commerce Secretary. So about 3-4 years ago, there was $200 billion total being spent by the commercial sector in aerospace. He predicts within 4 years, that will be over $1 trillion of private spending. Much of it can happen in Florida, particularly at our Space Coast.
Awesome. So the panel, for the most part, said that they think that Florida is relatively insulated. They'll address Florida issues and sort of stay on task. Now I'm going to ask you, do you think, by show of hand, do you believe that the national perspective, what's happening, impeachment and all the stuff going on in Washington, will that have an effect on the Florida legislature in this legislative session? If you believe that, if you believe it's going to have an impact, what's happening in Washington, raise your hand. Yeah, that's about half. There'll be some points that will be taking place, but I think you're right that Florida has their own issues and they can keep their eyes to focused on that. Let's go to speaking of issues. Yesterday we talked a little bit about the constitutional amendment. We saw some of the effects there, at least of the one that's going to go for $15 minimum wage, but there are other constitutional amendments. Let's talk around that, because if you recall back, Jeff, if you started this like I did as a young boy and started watching the propositions that came out of California, which is how they changed their constitution, and now they have competing constitutional challenges inside their own documents. They don't even know which way to follow, but who wants to be like California? The question is, and I'll start with you, General, do you see any major constitutional amendments that's going to be on this coming ballot, that'll get on the ballot, that can have an impact on the legislature? And I'm also going to let you say, I'm going to give your opinion on, should we do something about constitutional amendments? There are people that believe that that's fine the way it is, or there should make it more difficult. I'll give you your chance.
Well, certainly we're going to see some ballot issues. We always do get them there. There's a lot going on right now about cannabis, about marijuana, the issue you mentioned about the minimum wage. There is a movement afoot nationally that affects us here. That is the progressive movement, the radical left, I see it now. Further over there, anti-capitalist, against what this organization stands for in many ways, wanting to raise the taxes, wanting to have government run more things. And that movement seeps in through traditional means more in our state than perhaps some others, but it's definitely going to affect us with those ballots. I'm always concerned that we have too easy access to changing our Constitution. I think we should have a right to do that as a people. Some states in the past have had ballot initiatives that are restricted or principally directed towards changes that would last only like 5 years, not be part of the Constitution, be a way to go and vote something in, if you will, when the legislature is stalled over it, but they have a 5-year sunset or whatever to them. Those kind of options are things I think the legislature should consider, but I think we're just going to face what we've faced in the past. We're going to see several of these very controversial amendments, and if they're popular and a lot of money's put behind them, the chances of their passing become a lot more real, and we all have seen that, and I worry about those. I know all of you do too, but that's my sense of it.
Senator?
Well, I know you've discussed this minimum wage, really not a bad idea, like many ideas where you're going to have government controlling our private sector economy. But one of concern would be this marijuana, cannabis amendment. I believe, you know more than me, but I don't think it's quite on track to get the signatures, but I suspect that there will be major efforts by people that maybe they care less about marijuana, but they think that might benefit other philosophies that are probably adverse to what most people in this organization would support. And the big thing, of course, is the turnout. And if they turn out to vote, for example, legalizing marijuana, it's very possible, very likely, they might just vote straight, Democrat or whatever. So that's of some concern. As far as the access to the Constitution, I know you know this, but it takes 3/4 of the state legislatures to change the U.S. Constitution. It's done pretty well for 240 years. I served on the Constitution Revision Commission 22 years ago. And then I served on the Tax and Budget Reform Commission that meets alternately every 20 years, but the 10 years in between. And I'm concerned. I'm not sure that there's going to be an effort in the legislature, I think, to make some change in this. And I'm thinking more and more that it's a pretty good idea. I think what we've got is okay. I don't think you should change it just because of the time and the crisis of the moment or whatever. And so I would, I think we need to think about how we will address that if they're able to get some change on the ballot about these constitutional revisions, because they have no subject matter. So you can package, which we saw this time, something that's popular with something that maybe is not the best thing in the world. So I think that's.
Do you have a recommendation as to how it might be changed?
Well, one thing is a single subject that's being discussed at length. You should have to have a single subject on an amendment and not packaged together, which the Constitution Revision Commission has authority to do. Something might be popular along with whatever else, and so I think that should definitely be changed. And as far as what it takes to amend, is it 60% now? That's, we sure don't want it to be less than that, and maybe 2/3 wouldn't be so bad either.
Speaker.
So the U.S. Constitution had the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments adopted along with the Constitution. It's been amended less than 20 times in close to 250 years. So once every 10 years, and several of them came in the aftermath of the Civil War in response to some fundamental civil rights. AIF's foundation had former Florida Supreme Court Justice Ken Bell write a piece on what belongs in the Constitution. I think some of this is the fault of civics education. So the Constitution is not a place to regulate the size of pig cages. The Constitution is a horrible place to try to deal with issues like managing technology, which changes every 18 months. You want a representative legislative body who meets every year to be responding to those sorts of things. The Constitution should govern basically the relationship between different levels of government and one another, and government and the free individual population. Anything else ought to be left to legislative statutes. I think a couple things you can do. There's now enacted a budget estimating requirement, so that rather than asking people, hey, do you want minimum wage for everybody? I mean, if $15 is a good idea, why not make it $100? And the answer is it's not a good idea for small business or for students, particularly minority students that have never had an entry-level job to get some experience in the workplace. But if you had an estimate of the cost of things, Medicaid for all, healthcare for all sounds like a great idea. Put a dollar figure on it. I would make the threshold higher than 60%. And one of the things you could do on the threshold is right now it's 60% of those that vote on the amendment itself. It ought to be 60% of the people that show up and vote at all. So if for everybody that votes in the presidential election or a gubernatorial election, what happens if you got a lot of down ballot drop off? People just don't understand or don't care about the amendments. A lot of people go in and vote for the top 1 or top 4 positions. There are maybe 20 other people, local candidates, et cetera. So making that threshold at a minimum 60% of the total number of voters that appeared on election day would be one idea.
Senator, go ahead.
Just one comment. I think it was Susan McManus yesterday, but I know that this is true that in college today, unlike when some of us went, there's no requirement for any kind of economic courses or any economic education, nor is there a requirement for civic and government education. And so I really think for the future, which is what we're all about, and we fortunately had ancestors that looked out for us, that this issue of education is, the best hope. And that really should be changed, frankly. It should be a requirement that, at least government and civics and some basis of what the economy is all about, that you can't just, tax everything and take money from whoever's producing and so on.
This is an unscientific poll. We're going to get you in a second, Governor. If you believe what he just said, what Susan McManus said, that we should at least be teaching civics and government, at least the form of government that we have in our college and universities and in our high schools, just raise your hand. Just tell me if this unscientific poll, there's not a single person here that doesn't believe. Natalie, you believe in that. But the reality is that, as I said when I first came here, I fell in love with our state and the government, that we the people, and I think we've lost that. We send representatives, and when we start getting into this populism aspect, where it's just democracy, it has a lot of problems. Governor,
there are a number of amendments that can be enormously impactful. There are 2 different recreational marijuana amendments. One of them is actually supported by the current license holders for medical marijuana because it would lock them in as a cartel in recreational. They would be the license holders. So it's really a bait and switch. There's one that's open primaries, but you want to talk about a way to transform the way we do government in Florida, make the political parties irrelevant. That's a very impactful amendment that people need to pay attention to. The minimum wage one's not only problematic and bad economics for small business, but it would apply to restaurants, which don't pay, they pay primarily with tips. So that could have an enormous impact. Then there is another one that's actually very interesting that would require any amendment passed by the voters to pass the second time. So giving essentially a cooling off period, take away the heat of the moment and let voters think about it a second time. I was on the select committee after the Pregnant Pigs Amendment passed, and we really struggled with this idea of what is constitutional in nature. How do we set a threshold for what you can vote on? And we really couldn't come to an agreement with the Senate, so that's where we came up with the 60% threshold. But I just think, even then we talked about we wanted to avoid the Californication of our Constitution. That should still be, as Speaker Feeney said, the best way to do these things is with laws, not constitutional amendments. I think we've come to the point, Senator, where the CRC has now been hijacked, and probably we can do away with that, and we can still have people review our Constitution every 20 years and make recommendations to the legislature. But I put my trust in the elected officials in the House and the Senate to make have reasoned debate and make recommendations to the voters.
Kelly, I'd like to comment, not on the constitutional amendments, although I think everything that the governor just said is accurate, and I agree with, but on the civics question, I have been observing since the 2010 legislature passed the requirement that should have been in the law all along, that history be taught in high school and that civics be taught in middle school, that we still have a basic problem. We have in our state kids that just aren't getting that kind of quality education, especially about civics. We've got the Bob Graham Institute up in Gainesville, and we have Lou Fry Institute in Orlando. It's UCF. And they are addressing or trying to address this issue, but it's very, very difficult. If any of you ever talked to them about it. I happen to work with a group that spun off recently a separate foundation called Step Up America with the Ben Franklin Project. So I'm watching what's going into schools, public schools, that qualify for the standards to teach some of this. But what I've learned in that process is that about 40% of our civics teachers turn over every year. That's a remarkable statistic. And so the same ones aren't teaching it. And then there aren't enough dollars anywhere to teach the teachers how to teach it. And most of them don't know the subject. So we got it on the law, but we really aren't giving the direction and the guidance. And I would encourage the legislature to look at it, but particularly you all in this room, our business community. How can we as a business community, how can we as the leading leaders in the state, in this private citizenry, do more to get civics and history taught in our schools to our kids that don't know who George Washington is, that don't know who Benjamin Franklin is, that don't understand the basic principles of the Constitution, who are listening when they get to college and often cases to professors who believe that instead of honoring our history in America, that it was a colonial empire. We were all, bad people who founded our country and so forth. I mean, that is literally what's going on in many of our political science and our history departments, not only in our state, but throughout the country. So that is a huge issue for us, educating them about being future voters, but resisting that whole idea that everything was bad about America. Everything's good. The whole idea of individual liberty and choice and freedom and the things that we think of in the Bill of Rights and so forth, we need to teach our kids, and they're not getting it today.
Yep. Well, I think that's very well said. It's fundamental in a republic. If you're going to have representative voting government, you need to have people with a common set of values and understanding. I have a simple solution or suggestion for consideration, and that may mean it's wrong because it's simple. But if you haven't looked at the U.S. citizenship test, which we require every foreign-born person who wants to become a citizen, it's a pretty good basic evaluation of American civics. And I think whether you're born here, you're a temporal immigrant. Until we teach you what it means to be part of the American history and experience, I don't think, candidly, that you're able to fully and appropriately participate in self-government. So I think the citizenship test is one example of everything we ought to require high school students to pass as a requirement for getting a degree at a minimum.
Awesome. I got to move on. You can answer it if you want, but let me just say this. We're going to move on. We're going to the lightning round. We're going to start with you. The lightning round is I just want to talk quickly about term limits. And so whether you support them, whether you think they're too short, I talked to Newt Gingrich 10 years ago. Newt says, Kurt, the problem is Florida, I don't have a problem with term limits, but they're too short. You need to, if you can't do, you need about 12 years. You can't do anything in 12 years, you ought to be out anyhow. But he said it ought to be 12 years. Senator.
Okay, I don't agree with term limits, and for several reasons. When I came to the legislature, Kenny Plant sort of got me in there, but Phil Lewis, one of the greatest human beings ever, was chairman of appropriations. And I got in there and they figured, well, I'm going to be there a while. And they said, you're going to be trained. I was sent to a zero-based budgeting seminar for a week in Washington. I think Phil went with me. Also to the home place or homestead for IBM because the state was getting ready to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on computers, and we were trained up there. And so I think there's term limits every time people are up for election, and I really don't think that that's a good idea. I was involved in it. Phil Handy, we know Phil Handy did this, and he came to me and he said, I'm going to get this on. And he was well-to-do, and he believed in it, and I'm going to get this on the ballot. Can you get the legislature to do 12 years? And I tried to do it because I believed him, and they wouldn't even, he'll never get that on. It'll never happen. And then, unfortunately, it did. Right now, you see such a difference. And in the days that some of us were there that served a long time, public policy was one of the main. And less partisanship. We were elected, I was told you're elected as a Republican, you're elected as a Democrat, and then you're a senator first. And you see this going by the wayside with these short term limits. They come in and their buddy or they are running for speaker 6 years from now or whatever, and then you get a team going, and one of your team members has an idea that's kind of iffy on public policy, and maybe not even iffy, worse than that. But it's he's on our team type thing. So I really think that term limits has done more. The legislature was recognized as one of the best in the country consistently for many years. Pat Neal will remember that. And I really think term limits is not a good idea, but you have them. And so the best hope would be to lengthen them some.
Speaker.
Well, there are positives and negatives. I was for 8 is enough at the time. I think 12 is a much more responsible way to go. There's been some real fallout, and people are running for speaker before they've ever been elected to the House nowadays. I never thought or contemplated when I first ran. Of course, the Democrats had run the legislature for 126 years, but you paid your dues, you became subject matter experts in a number of things, and then your colleagues looked at you, and ultimately, maybe in my case by default, you ended up as the best choice. But at least there was a time for people to demonstrate good legislative skills and people skills and the temperament that you need to be a great leader. I think we've had great speakers, but it's almost been accidental. I think there's a lot of negatives to having just 8 years. I'd be fine with 12.
Governor?
I agree with 12. And I agree that Speaker Feeney's right on this. We don't have policy subject matter experts anymore. Policy is kind of taking a back seat. So that means we're not really passing the best possible legislation. I sat on judiciary for 6 years, was vice chair and chair. That never happens anymore. People don't. Often the chairman today has never even been on the committee before. And that means you're going to deal with the staff. You're not going to deal with the chair is going to follow whatever the staff director says. And so that's probably the biggest flaw, I think, in term limits is losing the ability, as the president said, for people to become subject matter experts and work together in both parties.
If I could, I authored the amendment, the only one ever to get a floor vote in the U.S. House on limiting terms. It was for 12 years. It passed in the sense of a majority, but not the supermajority necessary, 2 times in 1995 and in 1997. That's what Newt Gingrich is referring to. 8 is simply not enough. I remember sitting in Phil Handy's office having this argument with him about 8 is enough. 8 is not enough. And if there could be a movement to change this to 12, I certainly would be a strong supporter for it. It is bad for the Florida legislature. It's bad for our state. I go around the country. There are a lot of states that have no term limits at all, and we do. I think I disagree with my colleague over here to my left, but I think we do need some term limits. But I'll tell you that 8 is simply not enough. There is an organization, too, though, we should be aware of. It's been a little bit dormant in public eye, but it's funded by one person in New York City that is all for 6 years. And they will come back in a vengeance if they get a chance to. He will. And put a lot of money out trying to intimidate people in that issue. But I would certainly think we should try to get it to 12, and not back to 12, but to 12.
Gentlemen, this has been fun. We've got 5 minutes left. And so here's what I want to do, because he's sitting in the room. He's not. Where is he? Where's Dominic? Go get Dominic. He needs to be in here. Speaker Feeney, we're going to start with you. I want you, listen, Tax Watch plays such an important role as a member of the legislature, coming and talking with you. They're valuable information. So you get all this stuff coming at you, and you really want to sometimes just cut through and say, what organization is really giving me some facts and evidence? They're not lobbying me. They're just providing me great information. And I remember getting to know Dominic through my time in the legislature, and I could rely on his information. I could rely on the veracity of what he was saying, and it was very, very helpful. Tom, Speaker, would you please tell us your best Dominic story and how he impacted you one way or the other?
Well, I'm going to stick to the stories that happened before 5 o'clock in the evening.
Yeah, no cigars and rum.
So when I got to the legislature in
1990, as I said, the Democratic leadership had been at one-party control for about 126 years since Reconstruction. There had never been a Republican budget proposal ever filed. Even under Governors Martinez and Governor Kirk, and Governor Martinez is here, the governor doesn't file a budget in the legislature. The governor proposes a budget, and then the House and the Senate Appropriations Committees respond. Along with 3 radical colleagues of mine, we did a line-by-line budget called the priority budget. It was widely laughed at and snickered at until it started getting some real momentum in the press. And it had reduced spending at a time when the Democrats were fighting about which taxes to raise the most. And eventually there was so much pressure on the Democratic leadership to talk about something other than tax increases. They went through our budget line by line in the Appropriations Committee. My buddy Ron Saunders was the chairman. And they literally, for example, we were cutting 1% out of the total Department of Children and Family Services budget. They went to the 40 people that did the most to save children's lives, and they essentially said, well, the priority budget would force us to cut these 40 people. This one piece of their budget alone would result in the deaths of 897 children annually every year. So now, Republican colleagues, other than the radicals, were terrified of this. But Dominic essentially stood up and he said, there's great ideas in this budget. We can do government more efficiently. It's the mission of Tax Watch. And so as a consequence of that, we got to vote. Every Republican not only voted for that budget, but the funniest part of my career, now this was a totally fictitious budget. It was never going to pass the House or in the Senate. But Republican senior colleagues that had served 20 years came and started begging us to do an amendment to our priority budget to fund the bridge that goes to Sweeter Community College. And we're like, sure, if you'll vote for the budget and sign your name on it. Anyway, Dominic, you saved me from some of the worst embarrassment. As you know, there was plenty of embarrassment there. Mr. President.
Well, as I told you, I was sort of trained by Phil Lewis, who was actually one of the sponsors of this organization. So a few years goes by, and some of them, we have these little things. Who is that Dominic whatever that dare says my hometown civic center, my local civic center is a turkey? So I said, well, have you ever thought about maybe public policy? Seriously, the one point is, and Dominic, I think I told you, they didn't just say, who is that fellow? They had some other choice words. But anyway, but the point is, one of the first things that I learned in rhetoric. You can have all kinds of laws, but if they don't get funded, they don't happen. So the way you can control what happens is by priorities of spending. And so you can pass some way out, whatever, but if it doesn't get implemented and funded, so I think what tax cuts has done is made everyone, legislators and others, much more conscious. It's rallied the business people to this, that this is really what it's all about, is the tax and spend policies. And Dominic, you've done a great job, and I defended you several times.
Joe, would you like to answer?
First of all, I didn't serve in the legislature, but Dominic and I got to be good friends when I was Attorney General. And we spent a lot of discussion time because he and I both share basic free market capitalist views and views about low taxes. Because this state is what it is in large measure because we have a balanced budget and we have low taxes. And you just look around the country, from my experience in Washington and here, it's clear that this state, our state, is the best run state in the country right now. It is the best run, and large due to things like Dominic's leadership. I mean, we don't give enough credit for that when we look at it. And I think you do maybe in this organization, but overall, we should be very thankful we had a Dominic over these years that we're celebrating here this weekend, because you provide, Dominic, the kind of leadership that allows us to continue to be on that path and not turn further in the direction of wild spending and Republican tax policies that are in New York and California and all the other large states. Might even come to Texas, which, by the way, is a bigger battleground state than legislative races this year in Florida is. We don't want that. We don't ever want that. Thank you.
Can't say enough about having somebody of his caliber and his leadership. When I ran, like most people, I ran to cut taxes, especially the tangible tax. He's probably the first person that called me and said, "We're with you 100%. You know, there's a lot of pushback when you try to cut taxes about how many people are going to die because you're taking money out of the state budget. I passed a bill to double the homestead and make homestead savings portable. Who's the first person to call me? Dominic. That's a great idea. We're behind you 100%. But what really made me proud of him is this productivity awards. The idea that we reward state employees for coming up with ideas to save millions and millions of dollars, because the state employees go years without any raises or any appreciation at all. And this organization steps up and says, "That's a great idea, and we're going to reward you for it." And I've seen it in the eyes of state employees, what it does for them and how much more they want to work hard for the citizens of Florida. And that's a program that exists because of Dominic and his leadership. And so we're all enormously proud of you, buddy, and thank you for your service to the great state of Florida.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, General Governor, thank you for your wisdom and your experience. You know, they wrote the Constitution, I'll quote the federal one, and it's the preamble: to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And then we put together a Constitution that did that. And it's the Constitution that drives us. And organizations like this, like Tax Watch, who hold our political leaders accountable and educate them, is an incredible act of love and compassion for this great state of Florida. You live in a I was talking to Eric as we were seeing the slides there. We go, we really do live in a great state. And I hope you're proud of it. Continue to engage our system. And let's secure that blessing to ourselves and our posterity.